Hello, this is Newt Gingrich. Writing Grant Comes East and its prequel Gettysburg has taken my co-author Bill Forstchen, our friend and co-editor Steve Hanser, and me on a remarkable journey across the last 5 years. We are all three historians, each with a PhD in that discipline. Each of us has an intense fascination with our national epic and how history shapes our modern world. We are educators as well, and share a frustration with how the study of history has been too often reduced to a dry recitation of facts, without drama and excitement, a memorization of dates without a visceral sense of just how dramatic our national story truly is. We are a nation that survived in spite of the tremendous odds facing it. Our emergence to greatness is a testament to the wisdom of our founding fathers, the courage and sacrifice of so many patriots across more than 200 years, and the enduring idealism that is a hallmark of what it means to be an American. In our conversations about the crucial summer of 1863, when the fate of our nation, and for those who lived in the South, two nations, was in the balance, we found ourselves talking about the great what-if of American history. Could the South have won the Civil War? Across 140 years, debate about a possible Confederate victory focuses on those crucial days in late June and early July of 1863. Was victory indeed possible? Could Southern banners have swept the fields of Gettysburg and marched in triumph to Washington, D.C., where Lee would have dictated a peace that forever sundered America into two countries? As we speculated upon this scenario, we formalized a concept which we call active history. Speculations on the what-ifs of history have always been popular. Any gathering of history buffs, even historians at professional conferences, will often drift on to such questions. Could the South have won at Gettysburg? Could England have suppressed our revolution? Or in the modern world, could the dark forces of fascism or communism have triumphed? Our definition of active history attempts to codify such speculations into a rational and disciplined process, examining those crucial decisions that might have led us down profoundly different paths. We define active history as a serious attempt to look at decision-making based on contemporary realities and how different decisions might have altered our national destiny. Our first novel in this series, Gettysburg, is firmly rooted in historical facts. What might have happened if, on the eve of that epic battle, General Lee, the real General Lee, came to the conclusion that he was not firmly in control of his army or of the campaign about to unfold. From that specific point, our 5-year effort began. We call that moment Lee's Epiphany, and it is the departure point for our series. Active history is a discipline that requires rigorous study of the personalities involved. Lee must act as he truly might have. For example, to base a story around a suddenly aggressive General McClellan at Antietam would not fit our definition, for in every field where McClellan commanded, his efforts were marred by temerity and indecision. Nor should there be any magic bullet, a key figure suddenly removed by random chance, such as Churchill dying in the Boer War or in an auto accident in New York in 1929, and thus not being present to so dramatically save Western civilization in the summer of 1940. We believe that active history must be approached as a discipline that first examines the facts and from one departure point systematically evaluates what might have resulted if certain decisions had gone along a different path, a path fully plausible and which fits within a credible historical framework. Such an approach to history can restore vigor to the study of our past, especially with students and teachers who wish to breathe renewed life into their subject. We found ourselves asking, why is history so disdained by so many, not just in the classroom, but by so many beyond school years, who look back and shudder at the boring, painful hours spent in classrooms? If ever there is a subject which should excite and enthrall us, it is our national epic. When examined through active history, otherwise dull questions of the past can have new life breathed into them. Could Lee have won? How would we as a nation be different today if he had? Remember that at any given moment, be it Gettysburg, the eve of D-Day, the stand of Reagan against communism, or our own confrontation with global terrorism, one decision by a leader might very well have made a profound difference on whether we as a nation would live or die, whether we ourselves would even be alive at this moment. And this was our departure point for Grant Comes East, the second book in our series on the Gettysburg campaign. Our first book, Gettysburg, taking an active history approach, evaluated what might have happened if Lee had heeded General Longstreet's counsel and on the evening of July 1, 1863, abandoned the field of Gettysburg and swinging far to the south and east by a bold maneuver, placed the Army of Northern Virginia far into the rear of the Union lines. In one sense, the writing of this book was fairly easy once we got started. Gettysburg is perhaps the most intensely studied campaign in American history, and there was a wealth of information, stories, and vignettes for us to draw upon, even as we moved along an alternative path. We tried, as carefully as possible, to parallel reality for many individuals and to draw as well interesting alternatives such as General Armistead advancing this time in triumph and Colonel Chamberlain holding the critical flank, but this time in an impossible position to maintain. We end that novel with Lee triumphant, and there we closed our story. We had completed our first task, to look at Gettysburg in an alternate vision, but a far more fundamental question still remained. Could such a victory have ended the Civil War with a final Confederate triumph? Many in the past, when speculating on this question, assume a Confederate victory at Gettysburg would have ended the conflict. Perhaps the most famous is McKinley Cantor's delightful book, If the South Had Won the Civil War. He concludes that after a victory at Gettysburg, Jeb Stuart several days later marches up the steps of the White House and takes President Lincoln prisoner. It is a wonderful tale, but neglects the true historical facts. One of our tenets of active history is to adhere to the reality of the moment. The weather after Gettysburg was abysmal and profoundly impacted both sides. Torrential rains flooded rivers and washed out the dirt roads of that time. Such weather would have severely hampered a victorious Lee marching on Washington, slowing his advance to a crawl and thus granting precious time for the very large garrison of Washington to prepare for the onslaught. The city was guarded by some of the heaviest fortifications in the world at that time, ringed with earthen forts, all approaches guarded by hundreds of pieces of heavy artillery, manned by a well-trained garrison. Within days of a defeat at Gettysburg, the Union Navy could have rushed in thousands of additional reinforcements to the city from as far away as South Carolina. Thus Lee, after a Gettysburg victory, would have been in a grueling race with weather and time to try and seize Washington, and once his exhausted army arrived in front of the fortifications, they would have been forced to make a desperate frontal assault as risky as Pickett's charge. This, therefore, becomes our departure point for Grant Comes East. The writing of this book was far more complex than our first volume, Gettysburg. For now, we are truly in the realm of active history. It is no longer a question of simply taking the Gettysburg campaign and ever so subtly altering it. Now it becomes an open field of serious speculation of what would have come after a Confederate victory at Gettysburg. As our title implies, much of the work focuses on Grant. Triumphant at Vicksburg, it is natural to assume that President Lincoln would have hastily summoned him east to restore the situation. Here, then, becomes the race on both sides. Can Lee seize Washington, or at the very least, secure a Confederate hold on Maryland and Baltimore, before Grant can build a new army in the east and challenge the Confederate victors of Gettysburg? There are so many potentials here for speculation, and we spent many an hour and many an email debating these questions. What about the draft riots in New York, which historically, after the Union victory at Gettysburg, threatened to derail the Union war effort? Would they not have been far worse after the news of defeat? What are the shattered remnants of the Union Army of the Potomac? Who would command, and what would be his motives for continuing the fight? And what of foreign policy? Would a Confederate victory at Gettysburg perhaps bring England or France into the fray? And finally, the subject of the root causes of this war. Gary Wills, in his brilliant work Lincoln at Gettysburg, argues that the president in 1863 shifted the underlying cause of the war from constitutional questions to the far more fundamental issue based upon the opening statement in our Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. How might a Confederate victory at Gettysburg impact the African American community, especially in Maryland, and what impact might that have upon the war? We tried as well to draw in many other questions and personalities of that time. Walt Whitman, a favorite poet of Bill Forstchen's, will have his role, as will Judah Benjamin, the often neglected Confederate Secretary of State. Some of our favorite characters from the first book will be present as well, such as the very 20th century railroad man, Herman Haupt. We hope that in Grant Comes East, you will embrace our enthusiasm for active history, the rational exploration of the past, and the potential for how events might have evolved differently. We believe that such studies can serve several purposes: to exercise serious debate about history, to renew and invigorate the study of our past in an exciting manner, and, of course, as another of our heroes, J.R.R. Tolkien once said, to offer you a rousing good tale.
Audio Renaissance presents Grant Comes East, a novel of the Civil War, by Newt Gingrich and William R. Forstchen. Read for you by Boyd Gaines. Cairo, Illinois, July 16, 1863. A cold rain swept across the river. To the east, lightning streaked the evening sky, thunder rolling over the white-capped Ohio River. The storm had hit with a violent intensity and for a few minutes slowed the work along the docks. But already sergeants were barking orders at the drenched enlisted men, while rain-soaked stevedores were urged back to their labors. Dozens of boats lined the quays, offloading men, horses, lumber wagons, and field pieces. To the eyes of General Herman Haupt, commander of United States military railroads, the sight of these men was reassuring. They were veterans of the Army of the Tennessee, the victors of the great campaign that had climaxed 10 days ago at Vicksburg, a victory that had come simultaneously with what was now seen as the darkest day of the war, the day Lee defeated the Army of the Potomac at Union Mills. The soldiers disembarking on the banks of the Ohio were lean and tough, their disciplined, no-nonsense carriage conveying strength and confidence despite their bedraggled, tattered uniforms, faded from rainy marching in the muddy fields of Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. They already knew their mission: pull the defeated Army of the Potomac out of the fire and put the Confederacy in the grave. They came now with confidence, swaggering off the steamboats, forming into ranks, standing at ease while rolls were checked, impervious to the rain and wind, their calmness, to Haupt's mind, a reflection of the man that he now waited for. He could see the boat rounding the cape from the Mississippi River into the Ohio, the light packet moving with speed, cutting a wake, smoke billowing from its twin stacks, spark snapping heavenward, carried off by the wind following the storm. The flag on the stern mast denoted that an admiral was aboard, but that was not the man Haupt was waiting for. Haupt looked over at the man accompanying him, Congressman Elihu Washburn, confidant of the president and political mentor of the general on board the boat. Elihu, who had joined Haupt only the hour before, was silent, clutching a copy of the Chicago Tribune, out just this morning, its front page reporting the disaster at Union Mills, the advance of Lee's army on Washington, and the riots which had erupted in New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The stevedores tightened the lines, lashing them down to bollards, and within seconds a gangplank was run over, slamming down on the deck. There was no ceremony or fanfare, no blaring of trumpets, no honor guard racing down the dock and coming to attention with polished rifles. The door to the main cabin swung open, and he came out. Haupt had never seen this man before, but he knew instantly who he was. He was short, grizzled-looking, with an unkempt beard of reddish-brown flecked with gray. His face was deeply sunburned, wrinkled heavily around the eyes, which were deep-set and sharp-looking. His dark blue private's four-button coat, free of all adornment except for the insignia of rank, which Haupt quickly noted, was still that of Major General in spite of his recent promotion. Slouch hat pulled low against the storm, he came down the gangplank, and Haupt came to attention and saluted. The general nodded, half saluted, looked over at Elihu, and extended his hand. "Congressman, good to see you." "General Grant, I'm damn glad to see you," Elihu replied. "This is General Haupt, the man who makes the railroads work." Grant looked up at Haupt and nodded. "Heard of you. You do good work, General." "Thank you, sir. The respect is mutual." Behind Grant, two more men came down the gangplank, and again began the ritual of salutes and introductions to Admiral Porter and General Sherman, who towered over Grant, standing as tall as Haupt, returning his salute without comment. "Let's get out of this rain," Grant said. Haupt led the way off the dock. Reaching the crest of the bluff looking down on the river, Haupt paused for a second, letting the officers behind him catch up. The view stirred his heart. A dozen steamboats were tied up along the dock. Out across the Ohio and around the bend that led to the Mississippi came more, a long line of ships, the view lost in the mists and swirling clouds of rain. Before him was the rail yard. The war had transformed it beyond all imagining. the main port of supply supporting the campaigns up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, and down the broad open Mississippi to Vicksburg, and now on to New Orleans and the world. Dozens of locomotives, marshaled here over the last 4 days, waited, each hooked to boxcars and flat cars, some of them brought down from as far away as Chicago and Milwaukee. The authorization the President had given Haupt had been far-reaching, beyond the scope of anything done until now in this war or in any war. He had federalized 6 lines, argued with scores of railroad executives, and made it clear to all of them that they would be compensated, but as of right now, he was running their schedules, and resistance would be met with arrest. Haupt reminded more than one of them that Lincoln had suspended the writ of habeas corpus and would not hesitate, if need be, to throw a railroad president in jail if he, Haupt, should request it. The rail yard rumbled with noise, whistles shrieking, cars banging together as they were hooked up. It looked like chaos, but Haupt knew better. He had brought with him more than 400 of his best men from Alexandria on one of the last trains to get out of Washington before the line was cut just north of Baltimore. They knew their business, and in what appeared to be chaos, there was order. A small rail yard office, which Haupt had selected for the meeting, loomed up through the swirls of smoke and rain, the guards posted out front, snapping to attention at the approach of so many stars. Inside, a fresh pot of coffee rested on a sideboard, bread and slabs of cut ham on tin plates. Sherman and Porter helped themselves, Grant simply taking a cup of coffee and sipping from it as he walked up to the table, upon which was spread a railroad map of the country. He gazed at it for a moment, then went to the wall where Herman had put up a map of northern Virginia, Maryland, and southern Pennsylvania. Red and blue pins with small foolscap notes under them marked the latest position of forces. Grant turned to Elihu. "What's the latest?" Elihu tossed the Chicago Tribune on the table, then pulled a notebook out of his pocket and opened it. "Washington has been cut off from all land communications for the last 3 days. Stuart's cavalry has cut all telegraph lines and rail lines to the capital. The line into Baltimore was patched yesterday, but went down again this morning. Last report from Baltimore was of rioting. Rioting reported as well in Philadelphia, New York, and Cincinnati." "The hell with the rioting," Sherman said coldly. "What about Lee?" "He moved from Westminster 5 days ago, heading toward Washington. He's put up a good screen, no solid reports as to disposition. A courier boat out of Washington docked at Port Deposit on the north bank of the Susquehanna this afternoon with a report that Confederate infantry was reported 10 miles to the north of Washington at Rockville." "Of course," Grant said quietly. "He has to try it. It's his one chance to win quickly." "The rain has slowed him down," Haupt interrupted. "Every river is at flood, otherwise Lee could have been into the Washington area 3 days ago. Old Sam Heinzelman is in command of the garrison in Washington. He sent out some pioneer troops in front of Lee's advance. They've destroyed every bridge and mill dam north of the city and made a real mess of things." Grant nodded approvingly and sat down at the table, a signal for the rest to join him. Haupt sat down directly across from him, Elihu at his side. "Tell me everything. Start at the beginning," Grant said quietly, leaning back, rubbing his eyes, then putting down the cup of coffee. Fishing in his breast pocket, he pulled out a cigar, struck a lucifer, and puffed the cigar to life. Haupt began his narrative, describing the maneuvers that led to a meeting at Gettysburg, the flanking march of Lee to Westminster, the chaos at the supply head, the debacle at Union Mills, the disintegration of the Army of the Potomac, and the hellish retreat of the survivors to the Susquehanna, finishing with his meeting with Lincoln. Grant did not interrupt, sitting quietly, wreathed in smoke, stubbing out the end of his cigar and lighting another one, the smoke drifting thick around the coal-oil lamp that hung from the ceiling. While Sherman stood silent, Porter stood up to stretch, walking over to study the map, reaching into his pocket for a flask, which he half-emptied into his coffee. He made eye contact with Grant, motioned to the flask. Grant shook his head. There was a moment of silence, and Elihu cleared his throat. "The political situation, General, to put it bluntly, is on the point of collapse." "Go on." "First off, the riots. It's reported that New York is controlled by the mob. Scores, perhaps hundreds dead. More than half of the city has gone over to the rioters. What's being done? General Sickles has been dispatched with a brigade of troops from his corps. Haupt said nothing. Sickles' move had not been authorized by any real order from above. He had simply announced that as a general from New York, he was going there personally to straighten things out. And Herman had reluctantly agreed to give him 10 trains to move his men from Harrisburg to Jersey City. No one had said it openly yet, but the president will most likely face a delegation from Congress, perhaps already has done so, calling upon him to seek a negotiated settlement. He won't do it, Grant replied. I know he won't, but if Washington should fall, the point might be moot. The capital cannot fall, Elihu replied sharply. It cannot. If we lose that, I can promise you that the members of Congress from every border state will back off from this war, as will more than one from the Midwest. That is what you must prevent. Grant shook his head. I can't guarantee that we can save Washington. President Lincoln will not want me to throw away an army on a forlorn hope, and if I rush into this fight without preparation, it will be a forlorn hope. To defeat General Lee will take time, sir, and cannot be done with the snap of a finger. If we lose this army now, and he gestured out the window toward the boats discharging the soldiers of the West, we will lose this war. Congressman Washburn, Grant turned toward his old friend and mentor, you must convey to the President that I fully understand the political crisis we are in, and I will do everything I can as quickly as possible in response. The mere fact that we're coming east, even if with but one division to start, will send a message to Lee and exert pressure on him as well. It will tell him we have not given up, not by a long shot, and will force him to perhaps act rashly. However, Grant nodded toward Haupt. As General Haupt can verify, it will take weeks to move a force of significant size and to assemble the fighting power needed to engage Lee. The President should do all he can to protect Washington, but be prepared to evacuate down the Potomac and shift the capital to Philadelphia if that becomes unavoidable. Personally, I do not believe Lee can take Washington. Sherman and I spent months seizing Vicksburg, and it was not nearly as well fortified as Washington. Grant reached into his pocket, pulled out a neatly folded telegram, and opened it up. This was from the President, he announced, and put it on the table. It authorizes me to come east, to take command of all forces, and, as the President himself said, to defeat General Lee's army. That, sir, is my mission. And the capital? I hope it holds, but I can do nothing for it now or for weeks to come. In fact, I hope it barely hangs on. Sir, because it will keep Lee in place, Sherman said with a grin. It'll be like the snake trying to swallow the hog. It's a meal too good to pass up, but once it's halfway down, he won't be able to swallow any more, and he won't be able to disgorge and crawl away. He'll be stuck. A trace of a smile crossed Grant's features. My mission is to destroy Lee, to bring this damned war to an end. That, sir, will take time. Elihu cleared his throat and looked over at Grant. Concerning Halleck, Sherman walked around behind Grant, who sat unperturbed, silently puffing away. Everyone knew of the deep tension that ran between Grant and Sherman on one side and Halleck on the other. The year before, Halleck had worked vigorously to remove Grant from command of the Army of the Tennessee, blaming him for the first day's debacle at Shiloh. Go on. He has been removed from command, sir. The President will have accepted his resignation as of today. In fact, the resignation was effective the moment you arrived here in Cairo. Sherman grinned and slapped his thigh. About damn time, I say. Elihu reached into his breast pocket and produced an envelope bearing the letterhead of the White House. This, sir, is authorization by the President. As stated in the previous telegram, you are in command of all forces of the United States. Halleck's position is now yours, and, sir, you will answer directly to the President of the United States. Not through Secretary Stanton. Elihu shook his head. Attached as well, Elihu continued, is a statement from the Secretary of the Navy. Admiral Farragut will now have overall command of all naval forces, but when it comes to coordination and support of troop movements, he will defer to your orders, sir. Grant took the envelope but did not open it. There was a long moment of silence, interrupted only by the ticking of a station clock on the wall and the shrieking train whistles out in the yard. The second cigar burned down, a third was lit. "I'm bringing up 3 corps from Vicksburg," Grant said, breaking the silence at last. "McPherson is already coming up." He paused, looking up at Sherman. "Ord's 13th Corps will follow, then Burnside's 9th Corps, along with the men he detached to Kentucky. I also want Banks' 19th Corps from Port Hudson and New Orleans." "Isn't that stripping the Mississippi down to nothing?" Elihu asked. Even Sherman seemed surprised by the announcement. "The issue will be decided in front of Washington and Richmond, not on the banks of the Mississippi. Besides, General Sherman here will continue to play havoc with them, and I'm also leaving part of your brother Cadwaller's 16th Corps with him." He fell silent again, puffing on his cigar, studying the map, and then stirred. "Where we have failed from the beginning is in concentration. Combined, we outnumber them on all fronts, but we have piddled away our numbers. How many are garrisoning St. Louis right now, Memphis, Louisville, wandering blindly on the coast of Texas and Florida, even in front of Charleston?" Haupt smiled and was prepared to go into his notebook, but then realized that the question was a rhetorical one. The hard numbers could be discussed later. "I want pressure. I want it where it will hurt them the most, at the same time to prevent Lee from being reinforced even as I prepare to meet him. Bill, that's why I'm leaving you out here. Your job will be to keep the pressure on the rebels in the West and never allow them to shift any resources to the Eastern Theater. We can go over the details later, before I head east." Grant looked back at Haupt. "I want to move the troops coming up from Vicksburg eastward from here. McPherson's 1st Division is, as you know, disembarking now. That's just a symbolic gesture for the moment. The real effort will start in another week, and they already have their orders to move." Haupt stood and leaned over the table, moving his notebook to where he could read from it. "To where?" Haupt asked. Grant pointed at the map. "Harrisburg," and Haupt smiled. It was where he assumed Grant would want to move, and Haupt had been planning accordingly. "I can promise completed delivery of your 1st Corps to Harrisburg in 10 days. And the rest?" 10 days per corps after that. If the 19th goes by sea to Philadelphia, that will make their movement rather easy. The bigger problem, of course, will be horses, mules, wagons, forage for the animals, but as I said, it's easier to find those in the east than try to move them all the way from Vicksburg and New Orleans to Harrisburg." Grant gave a quick nod of agreement. "So you can move my corps to Harrisburg in how long?" 30 days tops for everything. I can prioritize the infantry, have all of them there within 15 days. But it will take at least 15 days, realistically more likely 30 to 45 additional days, to bring up the necessary support to wage offensive operations. I want this done right." Grant looked back at the map. "There will be more, Haupt. A lot more." "Sir, combined with the Army of the Potomac, that should give you the numerical edge." "I don't just want the numerical edge," Grant replied, and for the first time his voice was sharp, a touch of anger to it. "Bill, you said it 2 years ago that it would take 250,000 men just in the West to crush this rebellion. That, General Haupt, is the edge we've always had but never used. Our numbers and our industry. By God, from day one we could have crushed this thing at a fraction of the cost in blood if only we had concentrated. General Lee is a brilliant tactician, but it seems that we have all become focused on what Lee is doing and not on what we should be doing. I have but one goal before me," Grant continued, "and that is the task set for me by the President of the United States." He looked back down at the map of the Union. "To defeat General Lee and to end this war. And with God's help, we will get this job done once and for all." Headquarters, Army of Northern Virginia, Rockville, Maryland, July 16, 1863. General Jeb Stuart pulled off his poncho, water streaming onto the floor. Mud was clinging to his boots as he stomped them on the entryway rug. "God, what a mess out there," he sighed. Looking up, he saw the disapproving glance of his commander at his choice of words. "Sorry, sir." General Robert E. Lee motioned for Stuart to come to the table. General James Pete Longstreet was by Lee's side, sipping from a cup of coffee. On the other side of Lee stood General John Bell Hood, newly promoted to command of the reorganized Second Corps. The room was dimly lit, half a dozen candles around the table, the small house at the edge of Rockville abandoned at the approach of Confederate forces and now serving as Lee's headquarters. Jed Hotchkiss, chief cartographer for the Army of Northern Virginia, stood behind Lee, his map of the area spread out on the table. Lee, sighing, rubbed his eyes. He was tired, having been up all day, riding slowly, weaving his way through the bogged-down ranks of his exhausted army, which had been slogging for 6 weary days to make less than 60 miles. Colonel Walter Taylor, Lee's aide, offered Stuart a cup of coffee, which the general took eagerly, blowing on the edge of the tin cup and then sipping. "Your report, General Stuart," Lee asked, putting his glasses back on to look up at his young cavalier. "As ordered, sir. I rode a circuit of their outer fortifications and started back here as soon as it got dark. It was a difficult ride, sir. The Yankees have destroyed every bridge. Mill dams are blown. One of my men drowned trying to ford a stream. Dozens of horses are crippled, broken legs mostly, had to destroy them." "Did you get any prisoners?" Lee asked. "Yes, sir, 6 men. 3 from the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery, 2 from the 1st New York, and 1 officer, a captain. Shoulder straps indicate staff, but he's as tight as a clam, won't say a word. The enlisted men are well-fed, arrogant, said they hope we attack." "Their strength?" "Still not sure, sir. It was impossible to try and develop the situation, to trigger an open skirmish outside their fortifications. No regimental flags were shown." "Smart on their part," Lee said. "Keep us guessing." "We did pick up a lot of newspapers in a post office at Beltsville. Washington papers mostly, printed this morning. A Harper's Weekly reporting on our victory at Union Mills, and a New York Tribune from 4 days ago. One of the Washington papers said there's nearly 30,000 Yankees garrisoning the city." "Sounds about right," Longstreet said quietly. "It also said that Lincoln's ordering up reinforcements from as far away as Charleston." "He has to," Lee thought to himself. "He knows I have to come here, and now all other fronts are secondary." "The fortifications?" Hotchkiss asked. Stuart nodded to the Army cartographer. "Your maps are excellent, sir. Just as you indicated, they are they are massive. Ditching 10 feet deep, abatis, earthen walls 20 feet high in places. The fortresses are all within mutual support of each other and connected by communication trenches. One of the heavy artillery prisoners said they've got 30-pounders, even some 8-inch guns, Columbiads, heavy mortars, and 100-pound rifle Parrott guns in them. It was hard to see through the rain. Fields of fire are well laid out, each fortress covered on flanks by its neighbors. There are no weaknesses anywhere along that line, sir. They most likely have good interior roads as well and can shift to meet any threat." As he spoke, Stuart traced out on Hotchkiss's map the perimeter of fortifications guarding the landward approach to Washington. "I placed a brigade to cover the Rockville Road, another on 7th Street Road, and ordered 2 more brigades down to cut the Blandenburg Road, the railroad to Baltimore, and anchor our line down to Uniontown. By tomorrow morning, the city will be completely cut off." "Thank you, General Stuart. You fulfilled your orders handsomely." "Sir, I must tell you this will be one hard nut to crack. It makes our works around Richmond pale in comparison." "Do you suggest we not attack, then?" Hood asked. Stuart looked at Lee. Lee took his glasses off again and rubbed his eyes. "Gentlemen, the hour is late," Lee finally said. "We've had another hard day of marching. The rain and mud are exhausting all of us. I think we should get our rest. Tomorrow, General Hood, Major Hotchkiss, and I will go forward to survey the lines ourselves. General Stuart, I would like for you to join us. General Longstreet, I ask that you stay here to oversee the movement of the army." "One final thing, sir," Stuart said, and fishing into his breast pocket, he pulled out a soggy folded-up newspaper and spread it out on the table. "A Washington newspaper, sir, this morning." Stuart pointed to a column on the front page. Adjusting his glasses, Lee leaned over to read it. Halleck has been removed from all command positions and is retiring. General Ulysses Grant is in command and is reported to already be in Cairo, Illinois, with his troops following. I don't know this Grant, Lee said, looking around at his staff, but his reputation is known. It'll be weeks before he can mount anything effective, Longstreet said, leaning over the table to scan the newspaper. That is why we must act quickly, decisively, without hesitation, Lee replied. He did not need to say another word. There was something in his gesture that indicated dismissal, and one by one the three generals bid good night and left, the sound of rain drumming down, echoing in the room as the door swung open. Taylor and Hotchkiss saluted, bid Lee good night, and retired to the kitchen, where the rest of his staff were already fast asleep on the floor. Standing, Lee removed his jacket and unbuttoned his vest. His boots were already off, and he stretched, back cracking. He looked down at the map, his gaze following the traces in pencil of the route taken by his army, down from Westminster, skirting to the west of Baltimore, and now down to here, with Longstreet's men concentrating toward Rockville, and Hood on the road to Claysville and Beltsville. Dispatches 3 days old had come up this day from Richmond, and there was the Richmond Enquirer heralding Gettysburg and Union Mills as the greatest victory in the annals of war, rival to Waterloo, Yorktown, and Saratoga. Maybe so, but still it continues. The war still continues. One of the dispatches, in a sealed leather pouch, was from President Davis, congratulating him for a victory unparalleled in the history of the Southern Republic, and informing him that he would come north to review the victorious army and to offer as well a conference with Lincoln to discuss an ending of hostilities. The implication behind President Davis's letter was clear enough, Lee mused as he picked up the coffee pot and poured half a cup. The president expects this war to be over within the month, but that means the taking of Washington, the collapse of the Union's will to fight, the draft and anti-war riots in northern cities spreading. Then Lincoln will have no choice but to seek an end to it. It was obvious now, however, that the near destruction of the Army of the Potomac had not swerved Lincoln from his path. Lincoln had endured the frustrating repulse of McClellan in front of Richmond, the destruction of Pope at Second Manassas, the bloodbath of Union soldiers in front of Fredericksburg, and now the crushing defeat of the Army of the Potomac along the Pipe Creek line between Westminster and Gettysburg. Somehow Lincoln had this ability to focus on the positive and to endure, no matter what pain was inflicted on the Union forces. Now he was clearly pointing to Vicksburg as proof that the Union could win despite the failures in the East. He was a hard man, and forcing him to negotiate was going to take extraordinary effort. In the last fight, it was the mind and spirit of General Meade and of his generals that I had to probe, to analyze, to defeat. The opponent is different now. Grant? Not for at least 2 weeks or more, most likely a month before he will become a factor. No, my opponent now is Abraham Lincoln. It is he I must break. That meant Washington. It was indeed, as Stuart put it, a hard nut to crack, yet it had to be done and done swiftly. We must force Lincoln out while the northern cities still burn, while a nation scans its newspapers, reads the tightly packed rows of fine print, recognizes names of the fallen, and asks, why? I must strike now. It must be one solid blow. Every available man must be brought forward. The cost will be horrific. A frontal assault straight in, most likely on Fort Stevens. How many will I lose? 5, perhaps 10,000, upwards of a quarter of my men in half a day. One final, terrible price. With luck, the garrison will panic once the outer shell breaks, and the city itself can be taken then without the grim prospect of a street-by-street fight. Take Washington, then let Grant come east to that news. With good fortune, there would be no fight with him, for the war would already be over. Lee blew out the candles, left the table and knelt on the hard, rough plank floor, lowering his head in silent prayer. Near Columbus, Ohio, July 17, 1863, 7:30 p.m. Gazing out the window of the train as it raced across the broad, open countryside of Ohio, General Ulysses S. Grant found his attention wandering for a moment. He tried to ignore the pounding intensity of the migraine headache that had bedeviled him since last night, but of course nothing would work except for that oblivion from a bottle, which he most definitely could not indulge. "What are you thinking, Sam?" Grant turned and offered a faint smile. "Nothing much, Elihu, just drifting." He knew the reasons Elihu was here, riding with him on a train headed east. Elihu was an observer from the White House, sent to evaluate him. That didn't bother him. He was also here as a shepherd to keep an eye on him and the bottle. The last thing the Republic needed now was for their new commander to break down. That didn't bother him either. And finally, Elihu was just here as a friend, and that was a pleasure. Once he was fully in command, Grant's nature was such that he would take counsel from no man but the President. But it was good to have Elihu here now. Though the President had directed that the war would continue no matter what the cost, it was now his job to bring an end to it in the field. Every death, whether it was a death that accomplished something or a death wasted, as so many now were, would be upon his shoulders and his alone. As he contemplated this, he reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a battered cigar case, and drew out a Havana. Elihu struck a match on the side of the table that separated them, and nodding a thanks, Grant leaned over and puffed his 12th cigar of the day to life. The open window of the car drew out the swirling smoke and flickering bits of flaming ash. Grant looked around his staff car, actually a railroad president's car that Haupt had borrowed for the emergency. The appointments were rich: red silk wallpaper, heavy ornate tables, stuffed leather chairs, and a plush burgundy sofa upon which Eli Parker, a full-blooded Seneca whom he had just drafted onto his staff, was fast asleep. He had known Parker casually before the war in Galena. In his mid-30s, Parker was well-educated, a lawyer by training, articulate, and a paragon of organization, capable of keeping the vast mountains of paperwork moving smoothly. The door to the privy at the back of the car opened, and Herman Haupt stepped out, looking a bit pale. Elihu chuckled softly. "Still got it?" the congressman asked. Haupt nodded grimly as he slipped his jacket back on, not bothering to button it. "General, if you don't mind, I think our railroad man needs a little Madeira. It's good for his stomach complaint." Grant nodded, saying nothing. Around his headquarters, the custom of asking if a drink was all right had evolved. It was a subtle reminder as well that he should think twice before indulging himself. Haupt at first hesitated as Elihu opened an ornate inlaid cabinet set against the other wall and pulled out a decanter and 2 thick crystal goblets. Elihu poured the drinks himself, handing one to Haupt, who sat down by his side across from Grant. Haupt settled back in the leather chair, nodded his thanks to Elihu, and downed half the glass of Madeira. He looked over at Grant. "How's the headache, sir?" "It should run its course by tomorrow," Grant said quietly, trying to force a smile. Grant looked down at the reams of paper piled up on the table between them. Accounts from nearly every railroad in the North, reporting on available rolling stock, supplies, particularly armaments waiting at factories for pickup, locations of nearly every garrison, training depot, and recruiting station from Kansas City to Bangor. They'd gone over it for hours, and the sheer waste was appalling. Well over 100,000 troops were scattered in remote posts and garrisons up north, or wasted on meaningless fronts. Many of these would not be ready for combat, having lived a soft life for too long, but they could still serve a better function than the one they now occupied, and they'd learn combat soon enough. Elihu had pointed out to him how damn near every governor would howl when their pet units were pulled into federal service, men occupying forts in Boston Harbor, watching supplies in Cleveland, guarding river crossings in Iowa. The men who had these assignments usually had some friends in politics who had arranged a safe berth for them to sit out the war in comfort. When Parker awoke, he'd pick up the writing of those letters that would set governors howling throughout the North. Lincoln had tasked him to end the war And now, after 2 futile years of watching the stupidity, waste, and outright corruption, he would change anything that kept the Union from winning the war. For the first couple of days after receiving notice from Lincoln, he had been overwhelmed by the responsibility of it all. For 2 years, the Republic had waged war to heal itself, to recreate a single nation, but had done so at cross purposes with itself, and often to its own detriment. McClellan had been given the best chance to do so the previous year, marshaling close to 200,000 men in Virginia and Washington, then had wasted his supreme effort with only a fraction of those men ever effectively engaged before Richmond. The President had not helped, hobbling McClellan with orders to keep an entire army stationed near Washington. Yet it had gone far beyond that. Officers had plotted against each other, jockeying for power. Congress had played its usual games of maneuvering and deal-making, even while men died in the swamps below Richmond. Never had there been a single unifying purpose, a single will shaping the Republic to this war, a war that had to be fought with brutal, direct efficiency. He had sensed from the very beginning that this war would be profoundly different from any other in history. After the bloody battle at Shiloh, he had often talked about it with Sherman late at night. That Sherman who had been called mad when he declared that in the West alone 250,000 men would be needed. The troops stationed in major cities, however, would have to wait. The dispatches picked up early in the afternoon as they stopped for wood and water at Dayton were grim. All telegraph lines out of New York City had been cut, but indications were that the entire city was in anarchy. A New Jersey newspaper had claimed that the entire lower part of Manhattan was engulfed in flames, and ferryboats, packed with panic-stricken civilians, were docking in Jersey City, reporting that insurgent rioters had taken Manhattan. Riots were reported in Philadelphia and Cincinnati as well, and troops in every other city across the North were on alert. The troops deployed to suppress or prevent rioting would have to be held in place for now, and that thought filled him with frustration. The train slowed as it approached a sharp curve and dropped down into a narrow valley to rattle across a trestle bridge. There was a glimpse for a couple of seconds of a half-dozen tents, troops gathered in formation as if waiting for review, the men saluting as the train raced over the bridge. Here was yet more waste, but until the movement of troops and equipment from Cairo to Harrisburg was completed, every bridge on this vital line had to be guarded, especially here in Ohio and Indiana, where rumors abounded of Copperhead conspiracies and even of Confederate raiders coming up from Kentucky. This was the core of the problem. Where could he pull troops out and yet at the same time maintain some level of safety? The motley-looking garrison on the bridge could do precious little if a real force of raiders showed up, but they were still a deterrent against the lone bridge burner or a drunken mob. It was the problem that had bedeviled the Union cause since the first days of the war, exasperated by panicky governors, or worse, selfish governors concerned only with their own state, even if it hurt the Union. The 30 men on that bridge multiplied 1,000 times could be yet another corps facing Lee. His frustration was compounded by the entire system of mobilization, of state governors responsible for recruiting troops and only then transferring them over to the federal government. The regiments recruited for 3 years were obviously destined for the front, but for each of them created, there would usually be a 3-month regiment that never left their state capital, and 9-month regiments that barely had time to learn their jobs before being demobilized. Everyone knew the 3-month regiments were a farce, a dodge for those who had political connections to avoid service, yet wanted to be able to thump their chests and claim they had served. The hundreds of thousands of men who so briefly wore the blue uniform were worse than useless. In fact, a drain on the entire system, taking uniforms, rifles, rations, and pay while lounging about in garrisons as far north as the Canadian border. He smiled grimly at the thought of the reaction that would come when those men were indeed called upon to serve. Though he had never put much stock in the idea when it was first proposed, he found that now, in this crisis, colored troops might very well have a role to play, and he looked back at the pile of papers spilling off the desk, remembering the report stating that enough colored men for an entire division would soon be mobilized out of the Northeast and Ohio. He looked back over at Parker, still asleep. Once he was awake, a message would have to be sent to the training center in Philadelphia. A division was a division, and to hell with its color as long as it would fight. And thus he thought and plotted, a vision of the vast change that an industrial age was creating, a new concept of war wherein the application of mass upon a single point would transcend the old vision of the past, of lone armies led by an inspired genius fighting but for an afternoon on sunlit fields to decide the fate of nations. He knew that many would claim that this was unfair, but he had nothing but contempt for those who thought thus and had never seen a battlefield the day after the guns fell silent. The job of war was to achieve victory, and in so doing end the slaughter as quickly as possible. How it was achieved, still within the parameters of some basic humanity, was secondary to the final act, the creation of that victory no matter what the cost or how long it took. Elihu grinned and said nothing, pouring another glass of Madeira for himself. He hesitated, then poured half a glass for Grant. "It'll help with the headache, General." Grant took the glass and downed it in 2 gulps. It was sticky, far too sweet, but he welcomed it and nodded his thanks. The train drifted into the station, its platform and the grounds around it packed with a band, dignitaries, several wearing ridiculous red, white, and blue sashes, a line of troops at attention, and, spilling to either side, a crowd of several hundred or more. He looked back and saw Haupt leaning off the side of the back platform, reaching out to grab a satchel handed up by the station master and then waving. The engineer of their train, seeing Haupt's signal, blasted his whistle again. There was a lurch as he poured in steam, and the train edged forward, rapidly picking up speed. Haupt sat down again at the table and pulled open the small canvas bag snatched from the station master. 20 or more telegrams, simply marked Grant on the envelope, spilled out. Grant sighed as he looked at the stack of papers and gazed over at Parker, who had slept through the entire commotion. It was just about time to wake him up. There was also a copy of the Columbus Gazette, and Haupt opened it up. "Sir, look at this," Haupt said. "Lee sighted at Washington," a headline in the upper left corner announced. "Panic in Capitol," a second headline declared in the center of the paper. Grant picked the paper up and scanned it. The report was from Port Deposit, a ferry crossing on the north bank of the Susquehanna in Maryland, dated 5 in the afternoon. It was the nearest telegraph station to Washington in operation. Most likely, the dispatch had been run up from Washington by a fast courier boat. "It states that General Lee, escorted by Jeb Stuart and numerous staff, was sighted in front of Fort Stevens this morning," Grant said, looking back up at Elihu as he put the paper down. "So he's there," Elihu replied after a moment's pause. "Of course he's there. That's what he has to do." He looked away for a moment. "That's what I would do." He continued to look out the window, headache forgotten for the moment. "The president said he'd stay in the city no matter what," Elihu said. "He has no other choice now. I just wish I had someone in command there other than Heintzelman." Neither Haupt nor Elihu replied. The headache did seem to be fading. Whether it was the glass of Madeira or the newspaper, he wasn't sure. "He's right where I want him now," Grant said softly. "Who, sir?" Haupt asked. "Why, Lee, of course." In front of Fort Stevens, July 18, 1863, 4:45 a.m. In the pre-dawn light, Sergeant Major George Hasner of the 14th South Carolina saw them coming back. 1 or 2 at first, then dozens, and now hundreds. Most were wounded, cradling shattered arms, dragging a broken leg, or staggering, bent over, clutching a stomach wound which all knew was inevitably the beginning of the end. Moving up to the starting position occupied by Pettigrew's division before they went in, the men of the 14th South Carolina, along with the other regiments of Scales's brigade, had deployed into a shallow defile, cut at the bottom by a flooded stream, and there they had waited for more than an hour. All was confusion. The last mile of the advance through brush, an orchard, a farmer's woodlot. The roar of battle ahead was continuous. When the first shots had been fired, a wild, hysterical cry went up, the rebel yell, but gradually that had been replaced by the more disciplined, almost mechanical huzzah of the Union troops. Colonel Brown was gone, called forward to an officers' meeting, and now, alone, Hasner paced the line, moving from company to company, offering reassurance to the men who looked up anxiously, faces pale, as they heard the inferno roaring just ahead. Young Lieutenant Hurt came up to join him, obviously nervous. "It looks bad." "It always does, Lieutenant. Watch a battle from the rear, it always looks like defeat." "Pettigrew should have broken through by now." "Most likely he has." Hasner knew it was a lie. Someone would have come back down the road by now, proclaiming victory, the rebel yell echoing through the fog from the battle line. All that could be heard was the continual staccato of musketry, cannon fire, and the whirl of spent canister cracking through the trees overhead, clipped branches raining down. Mortar shells were coming down at random, detonating in the treetops, some crashing down into the assembled ranks of the division, screams following each explosion. It was obvious that their gunners knew of this defile, assumed it was packed with troops, and knew the range to hit it. Though sporadic, the shelling was unnerving. 14th South Carolina! He looked back to the front ranks and saw the color company standing up, the regimental flag-bearer shaking out his colors, holding them aloft. Without comment to Hurt, Hasner pushed his way back through the ranks of men still lying on the ground. Colonel Brown was back, sword drawn. Hasner came up and saluted. "We are going in, Hasner." "What's the news, sir?" Brown looked at him appraisingly and then wiped his face. In spite of the morning chill, he was sweating. "Bad. Pettigrew was repulsed all along the line. Some of the men broke through into the fort. We were almost sent in to expand it, but they were thrown back. Pettigrew is down. They say he's dead. A bad day for North Carolina." He hesitated. "Now it's our turn. We'll set it right." Brown stepped past Hasner and held his sword aloft. "South Carolina! Men of the 14th! Up, men, up!" The regiment came to its feet, officers and sergeants moving through the packed ranks, which were deployed in a solid square, the men of A Company and 2 ranks forward, followed by B Company, and so on, back to the last line, 300 men in a small phalanx, 15 men wide and 20 deep. To either flank were their comrades of the other regiments of Scales's brigade, men who had taken every field of battle they had ever advanced across. 14th South Carolina, now is our time. We will advance in column and take that damn Yankee fort. Once we are into it, Washington will be ours, and on this day this war will be won. Do you wish history to remember that it was South Carolina that won this day?" A shout went up from the ranks. Hasner looked around and saw that the hours of silence, of watching, of fear were swept away. The battle lust was upon them again. A muffled shout went up. It was General Scales riding across the front of the column, sword out, held aloft, pointing toward the fight. He swung down off his mount, slapped its rump, and sent it running. "Follow me, boys! Guide on your colors!" "The 14th!" Brown roared. "Remember, don't cap your muskets till ordered. Keep your ranks closed and guide on the flag of South Carolina." A shout went up as the column stepped forward, the line lurching at first, men in the forward ranks taking half a dozen steps before the men at the back finally began to move, double-timing until they caught up. The regiment to their left stepped off a bit late and then raced to form a solid front. Hasner ran to come up to the front of the column and fell in just behind Brown, who was walking backward, sword aloft. "Hasner to the rear of the column," Brown announced. "I want you back there. Keep the men moving, no matter what." Hasner breathed a sigh of relief, for he knew what would happen to the first rank once they were within canister range. And yet, as he looked at Brown, he felt regret. The man was caught up in the moment. He was at the center of the charge, out in front, and Washington was before them. If he survived this day, if they took the fort, it would be remembered forever. Hasner ran to one side, to the gap between his regiment and the one on their left flank, and stood awestruck as the column passed. They were wide-eyed, rifles at the shoulder, already hunching forward slightly as if going into a storm. But they came on relentlessly, some of the men shouting, others cursing. Even the ones trembling with fear staggered forward, for none would dare to turn back now. The column passed. They swept up past an open grove of trees where a tarpaulin was spread, glistening with the heavy dew of morning. Coming out from underneath the tarpaulin was a knot of officers, and all immediately recognized who was in the center of the group. In spite of orders, a shout went up. "Lee! "Lee! Lee!" The column swept along the edge of the grove, and there he stood, hat off, hand raised in salute. Hasner saluted as they marched by, and for an instant he thought the general was looking straight at him. If Bobby Lee was ordering them in, then surely victory was ahead, for when had they ever failed? The first casualties dropped, a mortar shell, most likely fired at random, exploding in the air above the middle of the column, men collapsing. The ranks behind them opening, pushing to get around the bodies, then closing back up. The gradual slope began to shallow out into level ground. All ahead was smoke, fog, shadows. To the east, the horizon was a dull gray, a bit brighter than the rest of the heavens, the ground fog having risen during the night, obscuring the stars. Bullets snicked the air overhead, fluttering by like angry bees, random shots from the fight up ahead. A shell fluttered over, fuse visible, sputtering and trailing sparks. "Double time!" The cry echoed up and down the swaying columns. The drummer boys picked up the tempo of their beat. Still nothing in the mist. He wondered how Scales knew which way to go. How long had they been moving? 5 minutes now? 7? 10? They should be almost there. There was nothing but mist, smoke, scattered bodies. Where were they going? As if in answer to a desperate, terrible prayer, the mist seemed to part. Hasner moved from the center over to the side of the column, looking up through the 20-yard gap between his regiment and the one to their left. A dark line seemed to be traced across the low horizon ahead. He caught glimpses of men moving along the top of it. The ground before them was nothing but a mad tangle of bodies, men writhing in agony, others lying prone, hunkered down, curled up, hands and arms covering their heads, a few with poised rifles raised, continuing to fight. "Charge, boys, charge!" A wild shout erupted from the column. The drummer boys, all sense of tempo gone, began to beat furiously. Men surged forward, the spine-tingling rebel yell rising up in a wild shriek, Hasner picking up the cry, which sounded like wolves baying at the scent of blood. A flash erupted from atop the parapet, then another and another. The first spray of canister, 200 iron balls fired from a 30-pound rifled gun, tore into the flanking regiment, cutting a murderous swath across the front of the line. "Come on!" Amazingly, he could hear Colonel Brown screaming. He was still alive. "Come on!" Hasner picked up the cry, now edging in, pushing the man in front of him as the column regained momentum, pressing up and over the torn remains of a score of comrades cut down by that first blast. In the smoke just ahead, Hasner saw the first lines of the abatis. In many places, the sharpened stakes had been torn out or pushed down. There were 6 rows of them, the outer rows broken or knocked down, but the inner rows still intact in many places, here and there with narrow lanes cut through them. The column slammed into the first line of stakes. He had heard that some of Pettigrew's men had gone in armed with axes, but they had not fully cleared the way, and he caught glimpses of them, dead, some with axes still in their hands. By sheer brute strength, the column was forcing its way through, men slamming at the stakes with the butts of their muskets to knock the barriers aside, squeezing through the openings. The column stalled. Men from the rear ranks began to spill around to the flanks of the column, pushing up against the stakes. Rifle fire now erupted from the wall of the fort with deadly effect, men dropping to either side of Hasner as he ran along the flank of his regiment, pushed through the remnants of the first 2 lines of abatis, and pressed his way into the third. Turning, he began to batter at the stakes, screaming with rage, pushing his way through. A stake directly in front of him was all but split in half by a rifle ball that would have hit him in the stomach. He pushed it aside. "Come on!" They surged through the last barrier line. The moat was before him. It was a sight of horror. The filthy, muddy water was pink, the color clearly visible even in the dim light, filled with the dead, wounded, and dying. Hasner was knocked off his feet by a man behind him jumping. He skidded face forward down the slope, hitting a body on the way, turning to slide feet first into the slime. "Keep your cartridge boxes up!" he screamed, even as he clawed at his own and dropped waist-deep into the moat. Some of the men were already doing that, but far too many, caught up in the madness, simply waded in. With the first 2 steps, he lost his shoes, sucked off in the mud. He felt as if he was running in a nightmare, each slow step an eternity, water geysering around him. He stepped on a body pressed down into the mud. his bare feet sensing the back, the man's head, and he was glad the body was there, giving him enough footing to leap the last few feet onto the inner wall of the moat. He looked up and saw the barrel of a 30-pounder being run back out, barrel fully depressed. He flung himself down, the roar of the gun stunning him, the deadly impact striking the far slope of the moat, cutting down dozens. He stood up. "Now! Now!" He repeated the cry over and over as he staggered up the slope, losing 4 steps for every one gained. Stepping atop a legless body, he gained enough footing to fling himself up nearly to the crest. He paused, looked back, saw that Brown was still up, sword still held high. The flag-bearer was up as well, pressing forward. Then he dropped. Another man picked up the flag, following Brown, a wedge of men like an inverted V pushing behind them. The crush of men pressed up beside him, and Hanser fell in with them. They were almost at the embrasure. He pushed up the last few feet to one side of the gun opening, clawing his way to the top. It was now a murder match. Men fighting like primal animals, no quarter given or asked. Fumbling, he pulled out a percussion cap, thumbed it onto the nipple, cocked his gun, and swung it around, firing from the waist into the stomach of a man lunging at him. More men were swarming over the top of the parapet. The few Yankees atop the firing step began to jump off, running. He was about to jump down after them, and then saw to his right that the crew of the 30-pounder were still at their position, a sergeant slapping a friction primer into the breech, pulling the lanyard taut, screaming for the crew to jump back. Colonel Brown was up into the embrasure, turning, looking back, shouting incoherently. He was so close that Hanser could almost touch him. Lunging out, he grabbed Brown by the arm, which was covered with blood, and then fell backwards, dragging the colonel with him. Where was the next wave? The mist revealed nothing. "We're getting out!" Hanser shouted. He stood up, pushing his dazed colonel up on the wall. Bullets were smacking into the earthen wall to either side, fired from the troops assembled below. He violently pushed Brown, who was still dazed. "No!" Brown cried, but Hanser ignored him, leaning down, lifting him up with his blacksmith's strength, slamming him over the parapet. He leapt up, grabbed Brown, and rolled off the top, skidding halfway down the slope. Brown tried to stand back up. "God damn it, Colonel, lay down! We can still take it! Not yet, damn it! Wait for the next wave! We can still take it!" Brown tried to stand up, blood pouring from his wounded arm. Exasperated, Hanser reared back, punched him with a numbing blow on the side of the head, and Brown fell, tumbled into the mud, and was still. Fumbling into his cartridge box while lying on his back, Hanser reloaded, awkwardly pulling out the ramrod, pushing the charge down while his musket lay on his stomach, then rolled over, capped the nipple, and poised his weapon. Pressed flat against the slope, he knew that for the moment he was safe, though those on the far side of the moat were trapped in hell. Hundreds of men, thinking as he did, had pressed themselves down into the forward slope of the fort, the ground defilade that could not be hit. The 30-pounder, only feet away, could sweep the far slope and the fields beyond, but it could not touch him, though the roar of it would leave him deafened. Any infantry that tried to pick him off would have to stand atop the parapet, and several did try in the next few minutes, only to be riddled, as 100 or more fired on them, offering back some small measure of revenge for the carnage. It was a stalemate. Hanser looked around, recognizing some faces from his regiment. "We stay here," he shouted. "Stay here, don't fall back or you'll be slaughtered. Stay here till the next wave comes, then we go back in." He looked back to the east. The sun was breaking the horizon, dull red as it shone through the smoke and the fog, which would soon burn away. It was going to be a hot day. It was going to be a very long day. In front of Fort Stevens, July 18, 1863, 6:45 a.m. "General Hood, is your old division finally ready to go in?" Lee looked at his corps commander with unveiled exasperation. The attack was supposed to have been launched with 3 full divisions in place. Instead, only 2 had been ready to go before dawn, and even then, Perrin's division had taken a full hour longer than expected to attack. The 3rd Division, Hood's old command, was only now completing its deployment off the road. "General, the road is a nightmare. I still don't have Law's brigade in place." "Send everything you have in now, or we shall lose our chance," Lee snapped. "General Lee, the attack is failing. I ask that we hold my division back." "No, sir, you will commit immediately." Hood hesitated. "Now, General, now. We've lost 2 divisions trying to breach their line. Are you telling me that the sacrifice is to be wasted? One more push and we break through." Hood said nothing. Looking past Lee, he saw General Longstreet approach without fanfare, mount covered in sweat, and dismount. "Have we taken it?" Longstreet asked. "No, we have not taken it," Lee replied sharply. "Yet." Longstreet nodded sagely, saying nothing, looking over at Hood. "It was not coordinated as well as we could have wished," Hood said softly. "Night attacks on this scale are simply impossible to coordinate well in the dark and the mud." Lee looked at him sharply, and the commander of the 2nd Corps fell silent. "You have my orders, General Hood. Now execute." Hood saluted and without further argument left the grove, his staff running before him, the deployed troops coming to their feet. There was no cheering now, but the men were game, ready for what was ahead. "How goes it, sir?" Longstreet asked. Lee wearily shook his head. "It was not properly coordinated, General. Pettigrew went in nearly an hour late. It appears the Yankee pickets had advance warning, at least enough so that their artillery opened before the attack had even hit the abatis. Perrin's men got tangled up moving up to the start position. Now Hood's old division is starting late as well. He claims the road was all but impassable." "It is, sir." Lee looked over at him coldly. "Your lead division, is it ready to exploit the breakthrough?" "Sir, it will be an hour or more before McLaws is in position. They're filing off the road even now on the other side of the creek." "An hour? I ordered you to have McLaws up by dawn." "Sir, we are trying to move our entire army down a single road at night through an ocean of mud. We won't win with excuses, General Longstreet." The rebuke in his voice was obvious to everyone within hearing distance. "We have fought 2 major battles in little more than a fortnight. We have destroyed one of their armies, and the capital is within our reach. We cannot lose our nerve this day, General. We must hold our nerve if we are to win. I propose to win this war today, sir, because never again will we have such a chance." A cheer went up, the rebel yell. Hood's division was going in. The moat in front of Fort Stevens. "Here they come!" Sergeant Hasner cautiously raised his head to look back to the north. He could hear them, but the smoke was still too thick to see anything. The muzzle of the 30-pounder ran out again, this time elevated higher to sweep the field. He lay back down, rolling on his back, looking down at the edge of the moat. Hundreds of men were still alive, pinned along the slope of the fort and down on the inner side of the moat. He held his hand up, risking that it would get shot off, and waved it in a tight circle to draw attention. Some of the men looked his way. He pointed across the field to the top of the fort and then to himself. Some of the men nodded, pulled caps down tighter, clawed at bodies that they had piled up as barricades, fumbling through cartridge boxes to find a dry round and reload. Colonel Brown, lying beside him, groaned weakly. After knocking him cold, Hasner had feared for a while the blow had been too hard. Perhaps he had broken his skull. But the colonel had finally stirred. "Hasner? Just lie still, sir. The next wave is coming, then we'll get you back." "No, I'm going in." "Just lie still, sir." Hasner looked up at the sky. The sun was far higher, red through the smoke, but already hot. He could see them now, battle flags emerging out of the smoke and mist, again the formation in columns of regiment and company front. "Fire!" The heavy guns inside the fort recoiled back, Hasner hugging the ground, arm over his colonel, the shock wave knocking his breath out. Screams greeted the salvo. He looked back and saw the entire front ranks collapsing, officers, one on horseback, going down, flags dropping, one with a broken staff tumbling through the air, 100 or more men falling. God, that was like us, he realized. That was just like us. The charge wavered, then pressed forward, men scrambling over the fallen ranks, color guards picking up fallen flags. "Volley fire on my command!" the cry echoed from within the fort. Hasner held his arm up, waving it again, and he prayed that someone down below saw him. "Fire!" The volley rippled from the top of the parapet, more men dropping across the field less than 50 yards away. "Now!" Hasner roared. "Charge, Carolina, charge!" He stood up, cursing himself even as he did so. His own heroics surprised him. It was an act of wild stupidity, and yet something compelled him, forced him beyond all reason or sanity to do so. For a few seconds he stood there, naked, exposed, and no one seemed to move. One man, then another, stood up. By his side, Colonel Brown tried to come to his feet, sword held feebly up. And then a wild roar erupted from the men of Perrin's and Pettigrew's divisions who had endured hell in front of Fort Stevens. Officers were up, waving swords. A wild rage was released, and a wall of gray and butternut began to surge forward yet again, crawling, kicking, climbing their way up the blood-soaked, muddy slope. "Come on!" It was only a few dozen feet to the top, the longest yards he had ever attempted or endured. He came up eye level with the top of the parapet, a rifle slapped down on the top, aimed straight at his face. He grabbed it by the end of the barrel and jerked it hard, pulling it toward him. He heard a curse. The gun did not go off. He pulled harder, using it as a handhold. The owner of the gun released his grip as Hasner came over the top of the parapet. With one hand he hurled the weapon at the gun crew of the 30-pounder and then used his own weapon to parry a bayonet thrust. Suddenly more men were up around him, the first few jumping atop the parapet, gunned down even as they leapt up. More came, and yet more. He swung his own musket around, aimed at the battery sergeant, and fired, knocking the man backward. Yet again he rolled off the top of the wall and into the fort. The Yankees lining the firing step were stunned by the sudden onslaught. Most were still fumbling to reload. Several turned and jumped off the firing step and ran across the open parade ground to join the companies still deployed in the middle of the field. This time Hasner did not hesitate. He leapt down, knowing that his only protection was to charge right on their coattails. He looked to either side. Several dozen men were with him, all driven by the same realization. The shock of hand-to-hand battle exploded in the middle of the fort as the feeble charge slammed into the enemy formation. He heard cannon fire behind him, but did not look back as he waded in, dodging, parrying, slashing, kicking, screaming, the madness of battle upon his soul. A boy charged straight at him, bayonet lowered. He blocked the blow, driving his own bayonet into the boy's chest. The young soldier gasped, staggered backward, and Hasner lost the grip on his rifle, letting go. He caught a glimpse of a clubbed musket and dropped to the ground, the blow missing. All was confusion. Feet. Some barefoot, others in shoes with sky-blue trousers, and he feigned that he was down and out of the fight. More feet, all with sky-blue trousers, stormed around him. He curled up as if hit in the stomach. Looking back, he saw scores of men gaining the top of the parapet. "On the wall! Volley fire on the wall!" The feet around him stopped. A ramrod came down, stuck into the ground beside him. The men atop the wall paused, rifles dropping down to the firing position. A scathing volley erupted, the man standing within inches of Hasner's face, shrieking, falling backward. Again the rebel yell, this time louder, confident as the men atop the parapet slid down to the firing step, jumped off and charged across the courtyard. Another melee, the harsh sound of wood striking wood and wood striking flesh and bone. Screams, men falling, staggering past, cursing, huzzahs, rebel yells, all commingled together into a terrifying roar that seemed to be trapped within the confines of the fort. A flash of butternut-clad feet, this one wearing only one shoe. More swarms of men were coming over the fortress wall, shouting, screaming. A field piece in the middle of the parade ground erupted, canister cutting down dozens. Still the charge pressed in, survivors climbing over bodies. The carnage that ensued was beyond Hasner's worst nightmares. Driven to madness by the slaughter, the men of 3 divisions, who had endured hell since before dawn, exploded in rage. The sally port at the rear of the fort was clogged with Union soldiers trying to escape. In the close confines of the fight, no one had time to ask or give quarter, nor was anyone capable of it anymore. Hasner stood up in shock, watching as the garrison was slaughtered, many of the men of the 1st Maine and 1st New York heavy artillery fighting to the end. Many bayoneted in the back, more than a few bayoneted or clubbed even as they tried to surrender. Sickened, exhausted, Hasner collapsed back to the ground and sat, unable to move or speak.